Why society tries to break the highly intelligent loner. There's a strange kind of person you've probably seen before. Maybe you are one. They sit at the back of the classroom, not because they're disengaged, but because they're watching, observing, calculating, thinking. They don't speak unless they have something meaningful to say. Their silence is not emptiness, it's depth. When they finally speak, it's like a sword slicing through fog. Precise, unapologetic, uncomfortable. And that's exactly why society, whether consciously or not, tries to break them. Because the highly intelligent loner doesn't need the crowd to validate their thoughts. They don't need noise to feel alive. They don't need to be seen to exist. And that's dangerous in a world built on attention economies, herd behavior, and social compliance. From a very young age, we are conditioned to belong, to play by the rules, to seek approval, to avoid discomfort. The highly intelligent loner doesn't reject these things out of rebellion, they reject them because they see through them. They see the structure beneath the performance, the manipulation behind the messaging, the fear behind the conformity. And because they see it, they don't participate in the same way. They don't laugh at what's supposed to be funny. They don't follow trends. They don't care for unspoken hierarchies. But here's the problem. When you don't reflect the expectations of the group feels threatened. And when a group feels threatened, it retaliates. This is not new. Philosophers throughout time, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Simone Weil, Kierkegaard, all warned us that society is not neutral. But it doesn't just tolerate difference, it actively suppresses it. Especially when that difference exposes the absurdity of the norm. The intelligent loner becomes a mirror that reflects the emptiness of collective rituals. And no one likes being made aware of their illusions. So what happens? Society begins to isolate the isolator. It brands them as arrogant, antisocial, too intense, or weird. But this isn't about the loner's behavior, it's about the discomfort their existence causes.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's dive deeper. Why does society fear the intelligent loner? Because intelligence combined with independence is one of the few forces that can't be controlled. You can manipulate the masses with fear, with incentives, with distraction, but you can't manipulate someone who has learned to think in solitude, someone who's not addicted to external validation. And that person is dangerous, not in a violent way, but in a disruptive way. They question authority not because they hate it, but because they see its flaws. They question culture not out of cynicism, but because they refuse to accept meaninglessness as a lifestyle. They live with a kind of internal compass that makes them unpredictable, and unpredictability threatens the machine. But let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how society rewards intelligence only when it's useful to the system? You get good grades, solve equations, build the next app, increase shareholder value, then you're praised. But if your intelligence leads you to question the system itself, if it causes you to challenge the very structure of education, capitalism, religion, or politics, you're labeled as a problem. A dreamer, wise, a downer, a threat. Why is that? Because society doesn't want intelligence, it wants compliance masked as intelligence. It wants cleverness without insight, productivity without philosophy, genius without rebellion. But the loner, by nature, sees the absurdity of this bargain. They don't want to be another cog in the machine. They want to understand what the machine is, why it exists, and whether we should even be part of it. That's a dangerous question, because once you start asking it, the whole illusion starts to fall apart. Now, don't misunderstand me. Not every loner is intelligent, and not every intelligent person is a loner. But there's a pattern, a very real, very consistent pattern, where those who combine deep thinking with solitude eventually find themselves at odds with the collective, not because they're better, but because they're awake. And it hurts to be awake in a world that is sleepwalking. So how does society try to break them? Subtly, systematically. First, through education. The school system is designed around conformity, not creativity. Sit still, memorize, regurgitate. Don't question the premise. Don't challenge the teacher. Don't think sideways. The highly intelligent loner struggles here not because they can't do it, but because it feels inhuman. They're not interested in the answer, they're interested in the question behind the answer. That makes them difficult, uncooperative, too abstract. The system flags them early, not because they're failing, but because they're not following. Then comes social pressure. Friends who don't understand your silence, peers who mock your curiosity, parents who want you to be more normal. You learn to hide your thoughts. You learn to smile when you're dying inside. You learn to play dumb so others feel smart. And slowly, if you're not careful, you start to believe that something is wrong with you. But what if nothing's wrong? What if the system is just allergic to souls it can't domesticate? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a philosophical reality. Plato's allegory of the cave explains this beautifully. Imagine you've seen the light outside the cave and you come back to tell everyone else. They don't celebrate you, they hate you, because your truth threatens their comfort. It's the same with the intelligent loner. You've seen something, you know something, and now you're trying to navigate a world that punishes you for it. But here's the most important thing: they can't actually break you unless you let them. The real war isn't out there, it's in here. It's in whether you choose to betray your mind just to belong, whether you shrink your soul to fit into the small boxes others build for you, whether you trade your truth for temporary comfort. The moment you stop doing that, you become free. And freedom is terrifying to those who've never tasted it. So let me ask you something. What parts of yourself have you hidden to avoid being seen as too much? What truths have you silenced so you wouldn't be left alone? And what might happen if you stopped apologizing for the way your mind works and started honoring it instead? The exile mind, how isolation becomes the forge of genius and madness. There's a point in the journey of the highly intelligent loner where the external rejection becomes internalized not by surrender, but by necessity. You realize that if the world cannot or will not meet you where you are, you must go inward, not to escape, but to survive. And that's where the transformation begins. Isolation, once imposed, becomes chosen. And that choice, voluntary solitude, is where the exile mind is born. It is both sanctuary and crucible, a place where genius is forged, but where madness also lurks in the shadows. Because when you strip away the noise of belonging, you're left with only one companion, your own mind. And that's where the real confrontation begins. In exile, there is no applause, no social mirrors to reflect your worth, no routine distractions to validate your existence. It's just you, your thoughts, and the terrifying question, who am I really, when nothing and no one is telling me who to be? Most people never face that question. They're too busy being busy. but the loner is forced into it. And what they discover there is both beautiful and brutal. Because intelligence, when left alone too long without grounding, becomes untethered. It no longer just analyzes the world, it begins to dismantle it. Thought becomes recursive. Every idea opens into another idea. Every certainty dissolves into doubt. You begin to see not just the structure of society, but the structure of reality itself, and that vision is both enlightening and destabilizing. This is why so many great thinkers walked the knife edge between brilliance and breakdown. Nietzsche, Van Gogh, Emily Dickinson, Tesla souls so attuned to the deeper currents of life that they could no longer function in the shallow waters of ordinary existence. Their exile was not just social, it was existential. And yet, it was in that very exile that their genius was born. Because the mind, when left to its own devices, when stripped of performance and distraction, begins to see, truly see. It's in the silence that the deepest questions emerge. What is consciousness? Why do we suffer? Is there a purpose to this life, or are we just spinning in a void of beautiful illusions? These are not questions for cocktail parties. They are questions that demand solitude and the courage to walk through it. But here's the danger: isolation without purpose becomes torment. The mind, when turned inward without balance, can begin to eat itself. You start to question not just the world, but your place in it. You wonder if your difference is a defect, if your depth is a disorder. And that's when madness begins to whisper, not in screams, but in subtle narratives. No one understands you. You'll always be alone. Your mind is a curse. And if you believe those whispers, you fall not into madness itself, but into despair. The despair of believing that your way of being has no place in the world. But what if the opposite is true? What if your exile is not the end of your story, but the beginning of your becoming? What if the silence is not a punishment, but an initiation? Throughout history, mystics, philosophers, and sages have spoken of the dark night of the soul, a period of profound inner isolation where the ego dies and the deeper self is revealed. The highly intelligent loner is often thrust into that night not by choice, but by difference. And yet, what they find there often becomes their gift to the world. Because the insights born in solitude are not meant to stay there. They are meant to be shared, but only once the mind becomes whole again. Only once the exile has become sovereign. So how do you survive the forge without being destroyed by it? You learn to anchor your mind through art, through writing, through nature, through physical discipline, through spiritual practice. Not to escape your thoughts, but to give them form. Because genius without form is chaos. But genius with form, that's revolution. You must become both the storm and the sculptor. You must learn to hold paradox, to be exiled, but not bitter, to be alone, but not lost, to be misunderstood, but still speak. Let me ask you something. What has your solitude taught you that no one else could have shown you? What truths have you discovered in the silence that the noise of the world would never have allowed you to hear? And most importantly, what will you do with those truths? Because the world may try to break the highly intelligent loner, but if you survive the exile with your soul intact, you don't just return. You reshape the world. The oracle effect, why the loner becomes the threat and the guide once the highly intelligent loner emerges from isolation, not broken but refined. Something strange begins to happen. The same society that rejected them begins to notice, quietly at first, with curiosity, maybe even suspicion. Because when someone returns from the depths with clarity, they carry a kind of energy that can't be faked. It's not arrogance, it's presence. They don't seek attention, but attention seems to find them. They don't chase influence, but people start to listen. Why? Because the loner now speaks with the authority of someone who has seen. And that's when the paradox of the oracle begins. Society doesn't know whether to fear them or follow them, because the exile has become the guide. The threat has become the teacher. Let's be clear, when someone has endured isolation without losing their mind, when they've transmuted suffering into insight, they become a mirror too sharp for comfort. The oracle doesn't speak in platitudes. They speak in truths that cut. They say what others think but are afraid to voice. They ask the questions that institutions are built to suppress. They don't care about status or hierarchy or reputation. They care about truth, and truth, in its rawest form, is destabilizing. That's why the oracle is so often feared. Not because they're wrong, but because they're right, too soon, too clearly. Think about it. Every society has its prophets, its visionaries, its oracles, and almost every one of them was rejected in their time. Socrates was executed. Jesus was crucified. Hypatia, the brilliant philosopher of Alexandria, was torn apart by a mob. Kafka died in obscurity. Emily Dickinson was unread. Van Gogh died poor and unknown. Society doesn't celebrate its oracles until long after it has broken them. Because the oracle doesn't just speak truth to power, they speak truth to illusion. And illusion is the glue that holds most of society together. But here's the twist. The oracle doesn't hate the world. They're not here to destroy it. They're here to awaken it. And that's what makes them truly dangerous. Because once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep. Once you see the system, you can't unsee it. Once you hear the truth, you can't convince yourself it was just a dream. And so the oracle becomes both threat and guide. They are a threat to the false self and a guide to the true one. They are the disruptive force that breaks illusions and the compassionate voice that helps rebuild meaning. But this role is not chosen. It is given by experience, by exile, by pain, and it comes with a cost. The oracle is rarely at peace. They speak with clarity, but they often live in tension. The world wants their wisdom but resists their presence. People want their insight but fear their intensity. And so the oracle walks a tightrope between visibility and solitude, between expression and safety, between being heard and being hunted. It is a lonely place, but it is also a sacred one. And here's the irony, the very people who once dismissed the loner now come to them for answers. The student who mocked their silence now seeks their counsel. The institution that rejected their ideas now quotes them in textbooks. The family that called them too much now asks them for guidance. Because the world, beneath its noise and posturing, knows when someone is speaking from truth. It may not admit it, it may not like it, but it knows. So, what do you do if you find yourself in this role? If you've walked through the fire of exile and come out with something sacred in your hands, you tread carefully, you speak with precision. You learn to protect your energy, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. You don't need everyone to understand you, you need only to remain true. Because it's not about saving the world. That was never the goal. It's about offering the truth and letting those who are ready receive it. The oracle does not convince, they reveal. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were too aware, too early? Like you saw the cracks in things long before others even noticed the wall? Have you ever felt the weight of knowing, but lacked the words or the audience to express it? And if so, what are you doing with that knowing now? Because if the world tried to break you and failed, you don't owe it revenge. You owe it wisdom, not because it deserves it, but because you do. The last rebellion, why honoring your mind is the most radical act left in a world that rewards sameness. The most radical thing you can do is think for yourself, not perform intelligence, not mimic brilliance, but truly, deeply honor your own mind. And yet, this is exactly what society trains us not to do. From the moment we can think, we are taught to outsource that thinking to teachers, to media, to influencers, to algorithms. We are encouraged to be clever, but not original, and to be informed, but not questioning, to be productive, but not philosophical. And so, even the intelligent fall into the trap of becoming functionaries rather than thinkers, living calculators rather than conscious beings. But the highly intelligent loner, if they survive the exile, if they embrace the oracle's path without losing their soul, comes to a final, liberating realization that my mind is not a problem to fix. It is a territory to explore. And that shift changes everything. Because once you stop trying to dilute your mind to fit the world, and instead begin to build a world that fits your mind, you become free. Not in the loud, performative way that trends across timelines, but in the quiet, unshakable way that radiates from within. Honoring your mind means refusing to betray your own thoughts just to keep others comfortable. It means refusing to dumb down your language, your ideas, your curiosity to meet someone else's expectations. It means creating a life that makes space for deep thinking, for solitude, for exploration. That may mean fewer friends, but more truth. It may mean less applause, but more resonance. It may mean walking away from comfort, but walking toward meaning. And in this age of curated identities and digital distractions, that's rebellion. Not the kind that burns down buildings, but the kind that builds inner empires. Because here's the final truth that few will tell you. The system doesn't want you to think deeply. It wants you to be smart enough to work the machine, but not wise enough to question it. It wants you to be educated, but not awakened. It wants you to be busy, but not present. But when you honor your mind, you begin to see the cracks in that system. You begin to see how fear drives conformity, how shame silences genius, how distraction numbs insight. And once you see it, you can't play along anymore. You don't need to rebel. Your existence is rebellion. And then comes the responsibility to protect that mind, to nourish it, feed it with ideas, not just content, challenge it with silence, not just stimulation. Let it wander, let it wander, let it be. Stop forcing it to be useful. Let it be alive. Because the loner's mind, once freed, becomes a lighthouse not just for themselves, but for others who are lost in the fog of conformity. You don't need to scream to be heard. You need only to be clear. And clarity comes from within. So let me ask you this, one last time. What would it look like if you stopped apologizing for your mind? If you stopped running from your depth and started living from it? If you stopped trying to be understood by a world that doesn't understand itself and instead became the one who understands? This is the last rebellion, not against society, not against people, but against the smallness you were taught to accept, against the mask you were told to wear, against the compromise that cost you your clarity. The final rebellion is this: to think your own thoughts, to speak your own truth, to live your own way, not just despite the world, but because of it. And in the end, when the noise fades and the lights go out, you'll know something most never will: that you were not broken. You were forged. That your solitude was not your punishment, it was your path. And that your mind was never a burden. It was always your gift,